Good afternoon, and let me say first that it's a pleasure to join you on this occasion for this important conference on economic thought. John Maynard Keynes wrote that the master economist must possess a rare combination of gifts. He must reach a high standard in several different directions and must combine talents not often found together. He must contemplate the particular in terms of the general and touch abstract and concrete in the same flight of thought. He must study the present in terms of the past for the purposes of the future. He must be purposeful and disinterested in a simultaneous mood, as aloof and incorruptible as an artist, yet sometimes as near to earth as a politician. Suffice to say that the modern mainstream economist is not a master economist. He, and regrettably only rarely she, must display talents that are strictly of one kind only, that of elaborate algebraic derivations tied to a timeless deductive worldview with policy implications drawn from common wisdom and first principles, often in the service of half-hidden special and vested interests. In this domain, the concept of thought hardly figures. It is alien. When students are told to think like an economist, the unsubtle subtext is, don't even think of thinking for yourself. If you were trained to think before you signed up to this discipline, stop. Economics today is an applied science, only in the sense that the established task of economists is to apply thoughts that were formulated long ago and laid down in textbooks as though they were holy writ. Mainstream economics departments are in consequence cut off from ordinary academic discourse. They do not truck with sociologists, anthropologists, or historians, and only with political scientists or sometimes psychologists to export, not to import, the doctrines. Doctrines which are, without exception, drawn from late 18th century and early 19th century thinkers, gussied up from the 1870s until roughly the middle of the 1970s, and hardly touched or revised in the 50 years since then. Thought, in other words, is no longer a feature of mainstream economic thought. The above is true, anyway, of the two branches of doctrine which are known in the United States as the freshwater and the saltwater. The freshwater for the strict, free, and efficient markets doctrines that emanate originally from the University of Chicago on the Great Lakes, and the latter for the flaws and frictions variant, somewhat more pragmatic, that had its headquarters in places like MIT and other institutions on the East and West coasts. However, notoriously, both saltwater and freshwater are really quite sterile. As biologists know, evolution, innovation, and therefore thought, occurs in the swamps, the bayous, the estuaries, and the wetlands that I like to call the backwater. And it is there that we must turn for a reprieve from this situation. The backwaters are obscure, but if obscurity is the price you pay for freedom to think, there are people who are willing to pay that price, and it may well be worth paying. Let us therefore make a down payment on some backwater thinking. The first thing that one notices in the backwaters is eclecticism and diversity. Marxism, institutionalism, Keynesianism, feminism, and ecologism flourish there. The space is crowded, the accommodations are modest, but each tendency has a place. They are different, but mutually dependent, and they support each other. Diversity and interdependence do not preclude rivalry, but they tolerate and forgive it. while crossbreeding and hybridization bring strength and resilience across generations, so long as the habitat hasn't been wiped out. Without pretense of predominance or exclusion, let me turn to the peculiar elements of economic thought that have most attracted me over the years. I speak to you as a true bottom dweller of the backwaters. I've been drawn to two aspects of the subject that have the least prestige in academic economics. These are data and policy. I worked mainly on policy as a young man, mainly on the congressional staff, and I've worked on data mainly in my middle age at the University of Texas with my students, particularly working on the problem of measurement of economic inequality, the things one can learn from that. But now, as a senior citizen, it may be appropriate to tie things together with some thoughts on theory. But let me stress that nothing is a priori. My insights on theory, such as they are drawn from work with data, most extensively measures of economic inequality at the global scale, and that work was in turn motivated by policy commitments, that's to say by values, by a certain sense that what an economist should be concerned with are such questions as how to get to full employment, how to improve the welfare of the population, how to pursue the elusive goal of economic justice. The deepest theoretical insight and judgment that I can offer is that economics is about a living and changing social system. It's a life process. It is subject to all the laws that govern biological and mechanical systems. It is, therefore, biophysical. It is not a matter of intelligent design. It wasn't created. It is not a matter of equilibrium. It is not a matter of that very basic notion of supply and demand, two forces balancing each other in some notional Cartesian space. It is not a matter of general equilibrium, and it is not a matter of partial equilibrium. It is evolutionary. And it must, therefore, obey the laws, especially the laws of thermodynamics, as economic entities are like every other entity. They extract resources from the environment. They either invest those resources to improve the efficiency with which they can extract more of them, make use of them, or they consume them. And as they do either of those things, they experience decay over time, and they release wastes to the ground, to the water, and to the air. This is the basic foundation on which basically everything should build, and which all of what are called heterodox economics, if it's thinking carefully about what it is and what it should be doing, and most of it is doing that, heterodox economics does build on these ideas, consciously or not. It is also the insight that mainstream economics, which framed its ideas back in the 19th century on a different basis. When you think about Walrasian general equilibrium, it's very clear that this is a different basis. It's a basis that predates the notions of evolution, of entropy, thermodynamics, of process, of biophysical and biological basis for economics. And it substitutes instead the weak tea of externalities, behavioralism, new institutionalism, and new Keynesianism, a kind of practice of robbing older and more meaningful words, repurposing them so that their actual meaning becomes obscure and is eventually forgotten. All of this is designed to keep economics in orbit around the Earth of equilibrium theory. And there really is no alternative but to make a clean break, such as Darwin made from the doctrines that preceded it. Biophysical economics is an economics of structure. It's an economics of relationships, of institutions, of organizations. Organizations I mentioned particularly because this was the theme of my father's work on the great corporation. The organization was take the place of the market process. The organization provided a bridge between the past and the future, a way to control both the design and the engineering and the production and the marketing of products in such a way that the market forces were placed in very much in a secondary relationship to the organization. So it captures the duality of large corporations, which are both more efficient in the extraction of resources, better able to master and maintain complex technologies, and also more fragile when environmental conditions change or the price of quality resources rises. This is the general problem of leverage. It amplifies gains, but it also accelerates collapse. So what is evident in the physical world is also reflected in the financial world. Hunter-gatherers, societies that were very basic elementary, were nevertheless very, very stable, and they lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. Agriculture has been with us for 15 millennia. Industrial society has only been around for perhaps, let's say, 300 years so far. And it does not appear all that likely that industrial society will make it for 300 more. A second big thought is that economic phenomena are fractal. The other day was the birth date of the founder of fractal geometry, Benoit Mandelbrot, worth noting. And what Mandelbrot found, the origins of his thought were actually in his work on commodity prices, is that what is true at large scales is also largely true at smaller scales. So what that means is that the conceptual distinction that many of us were raised on between microeconomics and macroeconomics is essentially useless. It is misleading. It is something that we need to get over, but we need to get over it without accepting the notion that what needs to predominate is some general equilibrium based at the micro level. We need to get over it in a different way that integrates the macro phenomena with phenomena at smaller scales. What was that division all about? Largely, it was a post-World War II academic compromise between two strains of thought, a pre-Keynesian classical thought and a model-based reductionism of John Maynard Keynes's thinking about macroeconomics. And then the turf was divided up, students were divided up, but in a way which was certainly not reflective of any underlying or any solid scientific consensus. And the correct foundation is neither atomistic micro nor the sort of superficial equation-based macro, but a mesoeconomics, a middle ground of structures and relationships. Third, to be useful, position I've held all my life, an economist must understand what policy is, and specifically what economic regulation is all about. Neoclassical economics treats regulation as an intervention, something which is imposed on an underlying market solution. Sometimes those interventions are justified. That's what the doctrine of externalities is all about. And sometimes they are not. And that's the neoclassical view. But if you believe that without the intervention, the market would provide a stable solution, then I invite you, if you're my age, to stop taking your blood pressure medicine. If you drive, I invite you to run your automobile without putting oil in the crankcase. If you are an engineer in an electric utility, I invite you to try running your nuclear reactor without a cooling system. The answer is you will get a disaster every time. And the same is true if you fail to regulate the professions, or if you fail to regulate the financial system, if you fail to regulate the food distribution system, if you fail to regulate practically any complicated modern system, you will find that it will cease working in a very short order. And typically it will blow up or melt down. In fact, we use exactly the same metaphor to describe the social consequences of failing to regulate that we use to describe the physical events when we fail to do so in other, in more tangible processes in the world. Regulation is not an add-on. It is the necessary cornerstone of complex social and economic life. Indeed, the quality of regulation, and not access to technology, and not education, and not the availability of natural resources. It's the quality of regulation, actually, that distinguishes an advanced from a more backward society in the world today. As I say, you can move technologies anywhere. You can establish an export-based, a free trade zone. Any corner of the world that has an appropriate harbor or an appropriate airfield. You can educate, and people do educate in the poorer countries of the world to a very high standard. You can have all kinds of resources. You can have great land, you can have oil, all kinds of things like that. But if you don't regulate how the system works, it's not going to work well. And this is essentially, it's the problem of the socialist countries, that they did not have good regulatory systems compared to the advanced industrial countries that rose to the position of world dominance in the 1980s and 1990s. This is essentially a very, very basic fact about the necessity of effective autonomous regulation. And there's, of course, the failure of regulation, the undermining of it, particularly in the financial sphere, but also in other spheres, which is a source of much of the decay and decline of the advanced countries in the modern world. A biophysical economics of structures and relations has the need and the space for many forms of expertise. You can use people who know something, who know a lot about agriculture, about industry, about finance, about transportation, about resources, about the environment. Indeed, the full spectrum of human endeavors is needed to make sense of the economic world. It is not reducible to a handful of maxims derived from first principles. And beyond the basics of reasoning, logic, and science, it's possible that a really good heterodox economics can't even be taught from a simplified core curriculum. And it's, I think, no accident that back in the days when economics was actually useful, academic departments were populated by people, I include my father in this category, but many of his colleagues at the same time, who got their training studying something else, came in from agriculture or engineering or industrial practice or the study of transportation systems or operations research, things of that nature. That's where the great post-war generation of economists was cultivated, and they came together in economics departments after they had made their mark in many other areas. I would move on at this point to a discussion of research methods. And I would, of course, love to talk to you at great length about some of the things that I and my students have worked on over now nearly 30 years, 25 to 30 years at the University of Texas at Austin. I would like to talk to you about numerical taxonomy, about discriminant functions, eigenvectors and eigenvalues, the use of pattern extraction from economic data to arrive at insights about how the world actually works, and particularly the way in which we have developed out of very widely available and inexpensively accessible sources of information, reliable, accurate, dense measures of economic inequality, pay inequality, income inequality, that enables us to draw, to see patterns in the development of the world economy that were otherwise elusive, and that showed in particular the way in which changes in the financial regime, the collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971, the debt crisis of the world in early 1980s, the collapse of the socialist states in the late 1980s, the liberalization of Asia leading to the Asian crisis in the 1990s, the way all of these things contributed to patterns of rising inequality in the world. So we've been able to document this, and we were able to do it because we started with an open mind about how to get good measures of what we were interested in, where to find the appropriate data, and of course, because people were able to put a lot of time and patience into working out the numbers. But time is short, and I will just say about that is that I would invite you to inspect that work and to understand that it is consistent broadly with the principles that I have outlined so far in this talk. It is rooted in a concern about policy. It is executed with methods which are evolutionary and which understand and take advantage of the fractal nature of economic systems. And it is in harmony with the fundamentals of a biophysical understanding of our subject. So while everybody has their own approach, that is mine, and I think it has some bearing on how a heterodox economics can nevertheless be unified into a true transnational and broadly relevant system of economic thought. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you and congratulate you again on your endeavors and hope for the success broadly of this conference. Thank you very much.